Good evening. A very warm welcome to the Mumbai launch of An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions, the new book by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. It's absolutely a pleasure launching this prestigious book at the BSc Auditorium. I'd like to invite the chairman of the BSc to present a memento to Mr. Amartya Sen. An Uncertain Glory is published by Penguin UK and distributed exclusively in India by Penguin India. We are very pleased to be launching this book this evening with Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen will be in conversation with Siddharth Varadarajan, who is another esteemed colleague, editor of The Hindu. Professor Drèze couldn't be here, the co-author of this book couldn't be here, unfortunately, for personal reasons. A quick introduction. Amartya Sen is a Lamont University professor at Harvard. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998. From 1998 to 2004, he was Master of Trinity College at Cambridge. Professor Sen has authored numerous books, 3 of which have previously been published at Penguin. Famous they being The Argumentative Indian, Identity and Violence, and The Idea of Justice. Jean Drèze has co-authored and co-edited several books with Amartya Sen. One of India's foremost development economists, Professor Drèze is currently a visiting professor at Allahabad University. In an Uncertain Glory, Professor Drèze and Professor Sen take a deep, penetrating look at India's achievements and shortcomings, especially where providing for its citizens is concerned, offsetting India's achievements in having a democratic political system and recent economic growth are the challenges of making this growth sustainable, equitable, and more inclusive. The authors argue for significant policy rethinking and dynamic reform to address these needs. An Uncertain Glory is a very important book of our time. It's informative, thought-provoking, and hopefully inspire a great deal of healthy debate. I'd like to call on stage Siddharth Varadarajan to unwrap the book with Professor Amartya Sen. I'd like to invite Professor Amartya Sen to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very privileged to be here today. I'd like to thank everyone involved in it, particularly the Bombay Stock Exchange. I was fearing that Stock Exchange would not be my kind of normal stomping ground. But I was defeated because I find that old friends like Ramadura and Mala and others being here. I'm very honored really by getting that symbolic presentation of the banyan tree, a kind of symbol of our wisdom, which is actually what the book is really about, namely trying to understand better what India is. I think that is an important point to emphasize. I was told I should speak for about 20 minutes to half an hour, but it's a longish book. It wasn't planned to be a long book. It ended up being a long book. But part of the reason why it's so long is that we thought that we should present a picture of India that is relevant and usable to people who either don't agree with our analysis and recommendations, or even do not think that these are the right questions. But India is a diverse country, but with a diversity of record, which is quite remarkable. And we have to understand better what it is. And in that context, we pose some questions and give some answers. And hopefully, I think with Siddhartha's help, we're going to discuss the more controversial elements in it. I'm sure that he's getting ready for that. I think that among the contrasts is the peculiar thing that the Indian economy around mid-18th century was thought to be very rich. In fact, so much so that Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, speculated that India was probably one of the richest parts of the world. And he spent a bit of time in The Wealth of Nations discussing why that was the case. And he thought that, I mean, in line with his own analysis, and I think in line with a great deal of economic wisdom, I believe, he thought that since the prosperity is based on trade, that one of the reasons for India's prosperity was the availability of navigable rivers. And he compared that with the situation in Egypt and China, why they were similarly, and Greece. And why he had some thesis as to why some parts of the world, including some parts of Europe, were not well developed, why some parts of Africa were not, mainly because he thought that other than the Nile Valley, there were not many navigable rivers. Now, whether or not you buy this analysis, it's interesting that he was trying to deal with a problem which in 200 years' time would look completely incredible, namely, why is India rich? But then, of course, by the time we were all born, and that things have happened, and at the end of the British Empire, India was indubitably one of the poorest countries in the world. Some people find it puzzling that if that is the case, then the Smith story could not be true. There have been recent work by people at different places, but particularly the one I know is Prasannan in the Boston College, which in fact indicates that if you actually compare the wages at the time that Smith was writing, the wage rate, the purchasability of commodities or the wage rate in India were indeed, in some cases higher, in some cases just a little lower, but just comparable with that in the most prosperous parts of Europe, including Britain. Now, actually, there is people don't read anymore things that we used to read when we were young, namely J.B.S. Holden, namely how tiny differences of probability could make a gigantic difference over time. Now, the fact that India was growing almost not at all at the time that when the world under the Industrial Revolution was growing made a gigantic difference. We don't have clear, very good data on it, but we do have for the first half of 20th century, which is the end of the British period, the growth rate of per capita GDP was 0.1% in that period. Now, if you take that kind of thing with other countries growing at even 1 or 2% over 200 years, it's quite a bit of time. That's where the whole damn thing comes in, that what may look incredible is in fact not so incredible. Then, of course, came the reform in the form of the political reform, the form of the British leaving. Indians began an independent career. The first 5-year plan, etc., began. And it's generally thought that the economic policies that were chosen at that time were disastrous, and there were very low rates of growth, you would be told, and what sometimes used to be called the Hindu rate of growth, which was meant to be 3%. In fact, during the Nehru period, the growth rate was about 3.5% to 4%. But actually, if you compare that with what was going on just preceding the independence, it was a gigantic leap up. It was still low compared with what could have happened. That can't be washed away, but to say that nothing happened is absolutely not right. But then that 3.5% growth to about 5% around 1980s, somewhat consolidated in the 90s with the economic reforms, which initially didn't look as if it was going to raise the growth rate, but it did, certainly established one of the bases of economic expansion. But I have to say that in the story that I am pursuing, and Jean Drèze is, and he apologizes for not being there. He was in Calcutta and Delhi. He says he's exhausted. So that can happen, I know that. But I think the first 5-year plan made the gigantic mistake. It is not the one that mostly people talk about. It's our thought that India went on imitating the Soviet model and went completely wrong. Had it followed the Soviet model, as Rabindranath Tagore had already discussed in his letters from Russia, which were banned by the British and continued to remain banned until independence, after independence, he discussed why he thought the most impressive thing about Russia was its determination to expand basic education, elementary education for all. And the country was pretty fully literate, quite rapidly, including Asian parts of the Soviet Union. They did make a gigantic mistake in being so deeply suspicious of the market economy that they couldn't get the bump they could have got from an educated labor force, because their economic policies in many ways were very counterproductive. But initially they had done quite a bit about healthcare too. But if you look at areas which had a combination of a market economy, which Jean and I believe is quite important for economic expansion, but which can work well only when there is adequate human capability formation in terms of having an educated, healthy labor force, that the situation could be dynamic. That's what happened in all this period of the first, while Europe was going through industrial revolution, and of course through public education, state schools, they were getting towards universal literacy quite rapidly, and gradually healthcare came very slowly, but ultimately that too. Odd characters there, even people like Bismarck, making statement about the need for universal healthcare and universal education. The Japanese, however, at the time of Meiji Restoration, they were coming out of 200 years of seclusion, and decided they were going to have accelerated march toward complete literacy. And indeed, Takayoshi, one of the theorists of the reform, said 1868 was the reform, was the Meiji Restoration. In the early 70s, he said that, look, there is no difference between Americans and Europeans on one side and us, Japanese. Our productivity is so low, and our economic growth is so awfully restricted because they are educated, whereas we are not. So they had a program in 40 years to make the country fully literate. And by 1905, there's clear indication that they were very close to it. By 1910, there is no doubt that they're definitely there. By 1913, Japan was, thank you very much, Japan was publishing more books. It's quite poor still, but publishing more books than any other country in the world, and more than twice as many books as the United States. That was the nature of the Japanese miracle. Human capability development, education, healthcare came a bit later, but did come. And then that model was picked up in Korea just after the war, about the time when our first five-year plan was beginning. The extraordinary thing about the Indian first five-year plan was that it was decided that basic education was what India needed, not formal school education. It had a Gandhian thesis connection, because Gandhiji had, in a rather broader context, praised the merit of people's education coming from their work rather than formal schooling. But that's pretty hard to do. The best way of making people literate is to have classes on alphabets and word formation, and making them numerate is to do counting and multiplication tables. And the first five-year plan completely abandoned any hope of moving towards literacy, just as when Korea decided they were going to follow the Japanese, and they were going to make themselves, within 30 to 40 years, completely literate, which they did. And almost immediately after, the Taiwanese, who had by then KMT was established there, decided to have exactly the same kind of program, and gradually the same was true of Singapore, and in a small way, Thailand, and so on. China, on the other hand, was doing education and healthcare not on grounds of the market economy-based success that Japan and Korea were showing, but on grounds that that is something which they took as a political commitment. Now, the oddity, this bad luck of India in some ways was that when all this was going on, India was the country that was left out, or South Asia generally was. And I think in some ways, both the right-wing Marxist market economists and the left-wing economists let the country pretty badly down. If there was one thing that the socialist countries, the communist countries had achieved, it was high literacy. That applied to Soviet Union, including Soviet Asia. Even now, if you compare the literacy of those parts of Asia in which the Soviet Union had been there, you'd see that the literacy rate is way higher. It was true of China, which is what I'm talking about now, Vietnam, it's true of Cuba, it's true of everywhere. Somehow this didn't become, excepting in Kerala, a major commitment. For example, my state, in which the Communist Party was quite strong, this was not one of the commitments. And I found as a student, I was never in the Communist Party, but I was certainly on the left, I found it very peculiar that we couldn't get people excited about mere, what used to be called in those days, mere formal education. Now, on the subject of mere formal education, Gandhiji, of course, had a thesis, a subject on which he and Tagore had debated. Gandhiji was argued for learning from work and even praised the spinning wheel. And Rabindranath Tagore had written a rather biting letter saying that the use of the spinning wheel consists of mechanically turning the wheel of an obsolete instrument involving a minimum of imagination and a maximum of boredom. And so there was a question about schooling. And Gandhiji was dead by then, of course, but somehow, and I don't think Gandhiji, if he were to be there, first five-year plan, he wouldn't have said don't do formal school education. He was making a rather bigger point about how education should come in human life. But the result of the first five-year plan completely neglected education. That, if people now criticize something went wrong, Mahalanobis and so on, the big thing that Mahalanobis missed out, it isn't the importance of light industries or cottage industries or the Ambacharka going for heavy industries. It is primarily that they decided to put no focus on education at all. So just as India stood still while Europe became rich over the 200 years of British colonial rule, the rest of Asia was getting immensely literate, whereas India was standing still. I mean, the rest of Asia to the east of us, Southeast Asia and East Asia. And of course, their growth rate became very fast, very rapid indeed. And India was completely, comprehensively left behind. On the right-wing side, those who were wanting industrialization, there was somehow, I think, a collapse of reasoning there about overlooking the importance of education and healthcare. We quote in the book the interesting moment when Jamshedji Tata arrived in what is now called Jamshedpur. And he looks around, this is F.R. Harris, his biographer, saying, and he decides that he has to do two things. He has to set up a factory, but he will also have to be acting like a municipality, providing free education and free health care for all. This is saw not as just a welfare program, but part of its industrialization program. But that vision somehow got lost in the period that we are looking at now. So, in some ways, let down both by the left and by the right, education proceeded very slowly. Now, I was involved in all those debates in the 1940s. I was in school. There was a man called Sargent who had produced a plan saying he would make India 100% literate in 40 years. This was about, I think, 44 or 45, he said that. And our leaders ridiculed it by saying India won't have the patience to wait for 40 years for literacy. That was 75 years ago, but even since independence and planning, it's 65 years. And we still have a third of the women illiterate, a quarter of the men illiterate. And even those who are illiterate, the quality of education can be often pretty abysmal. That's not to doubt there are really good elite schools. And you may find from Silicon Valley to Deutsche Bank, many of them are being run by Indians trained in India. So they existed, but the general level of education remained low, so much so that we found that in one of our surveys that people with 4 years of schooling could not divide 20 by 5. 50% of them could not, which is an incredible number. Of course, healthcare went gradually absolutely nowhere. Now, in all these countries, Japan, Korea, and China, because of its left-wing communist commitment, went for universal healthcare pretty early. China was not growing economically very fast because they were deeply suspicious of the market economy, and they went through ups and downs. In 1979, suddenly they decided they're making a mistake, and the market is very, very productive. And so at one go, they did the following things. They abolished the collective firms, which had a role in the famine, which I studied many years ago, in which 30 million people were killed, the largest famine in recorded history. They abolished that, had a responsibility system, not ownership, but security of tenure, which gave them a kind of all endowment right. And they did marketization of industries, which was a mixed bag, basically an achievement, but they also managed to pollute the country quite badly by having relatively little regulation. But a great success, growth-wise. Agriculture grew faster in the 1980s in China than in any other country in the world in the history of agriculture. And from the 1990s, the Chinese industries have been growing faster than the industries in any other country in the history of the world. They were combining education, particularly, and they already had a good base of healthcare with use of the market economy and in globalization. On the other hand, they made the third thing they did was a gigantic mistake. They decided that market work, their position before 79 was the market don't work for anything. Terrible. Now they decided markets work for everything. So they abolished at one go the universal health care. Now you had to buy, in an American model, your private health insurance. The insurance coverage fell from 100% to 11% between 79 and 80. And even though the base of big education, health expansion had existed, and therefore you didn't see the impact of it so much, it was becoming quite clear that the Chinese were losing steam in the expansion of life expectancy. Indeed, China had a lead of 14 years over India in 79, and by 25 years later, 2004, India's lead had been, that gap, China's lead over India of 14 years has been cut by half to 7 years. Not because India was doing anything frightfully good, but the Chinese were doing things that were frightfully bad. By 2004, of course, with the rapidity for which the Chinese are famous, they decided that they made a mistake. Actually, I should declare an interest. I chaired the advisory board of the Peking University Development Institute. And so I was in the middle of some of these debates going on. And there were a lot of university professors arguing for re-establishment of universal health care. But it was happening slowly. But by 2005, they took a breakneck decision to do it. And within 8 years, which is the last figure we have, there were about 96% universal coverage. So the Chinese life expectancy has started diverting from India again, and the restraint on the industrial expansion is removed, and it's, even though its growth rate has also come down, and there are many reasons why that could happen in a slowing down global economy, its growth rate still remains comfortably at the top of the world in this period. Now, I think the interesting thing is that India, over the last, not immediately after the reform, but beginning from, in this, basically in this century after in the first decade, grew not at 6%, which it had done. India's growth had gone 3, 5, 6, and then average of 7%, but actually touching a peak of 8.5% and 9%, generating a huge sense of what is normal in India. I would say it was pretty abnormal in India because of the fact that it was achieving something on the basis of a terrible healthcare system, terrible educational system, which sooner or later would have begun to bite. Now, the issue of inclusive growth became serious because it somehow looked as if that poverty numbers were not going down very much, but they were. And in China, they were faster, but the Chinese inequality was extremely high, not lower than India's, about the same. We used to think that was higher than India's, but as Ron and I saw in our book, that's a mistake. We were comparing our expenditure distribution with their income distribution. But correcting for that, it's about the same. And in both countries, inequality has been growing. But what's the difference? Well, the Chinese wage rate has been growing at 7%, 7 to 8% a year. In a real, corrected for inflation, India's at 1% or 2% at most. Now, the interesting point is not only that their wages were going up, which was not unconnected with skill formation and increase in productivity, but the increase in productivity was such that even after 7%, 8% wage rise, they still remain competitive, indeed a world-beating competitive. Now, India had even with half the population, there's quite a lot of labor force, and there's quite a lot of skilled labor. So India's growth rate concentrated on growth picture on some highly skilled industries, and that included IT, pharmaceuticals, specialized auto parts. That contrasts with the Chinese, where you name a product, they could make it. Whether I'm living in Boston, whether I look at my thermometer, my alarm clock, my my stapler or my coffee maker, not to mention when my visitors come back after having gone to Mohawk Trail and come back with genuine American Indian souvenirs. They're all made in China. They could make pretty much anything. Now that is possible for an education labor force. No one was actually as adamantly assertive of that, even though it was a market-oriented capitalist model that Japan and Korea had. No one was more emphatic on that than Karl Marx was in his discussion about the role of education, as to why he always regarded that the praise of lack of education as some kind of wisdom was a mistake. In fact, a phrase which anthropologists get very upset about, he described the idiocy of village life. And the primary purpose of the primary constraint in the idiocy was the fact that they didn't read and write much. And he thought it was quite important to read books, and so on. Now, I think that's the context I'm going to present, what a few time I have left in this discussion. The Indian growth rate peaked, did produce a lot of good results. I'm not decrying its achievement at all. But it was thought to be not very inclusive. But the Chinese is inclusive, but not very inclusive in one respect, a similar way, which is inequality wasn't going down in China, it was increasing, no less fast than in India, possibly even faster. But while China had more billionaires than India had, they were not living in a country where 1/3 of the population might be illiterate and where the quality of education is dreadful, where people don't know where they go for health care if they're ill and poor, unless you're very lucky, and where half the homes do not have private toilets, so that you might have to resort to open defecation. India has a higher ratio of open defecation, judging from the toilet numbers, than any other country in the world. And Joe and I found eventually that that's not entirely right. Chad has a higher ratio than that, but that's a very unenviable position to occupy. Now, I think it does make a difference, not only to the ambition of being a superpower, with half the population having open defecation, but it's also to the ambition of having a sustained industrial growth rate without an educated and healthy population, and without the facilities of nutrition and sanitation, etc., that which contribute to people's health as well as nutritional adequacy. Now, the book brings out these contrasts. It points out why even when the growth achievements were high, it was based on a rather limited range of products, and it never achieved the kind of flexibility and productive facility that the Chinese had, the Koreans had earlier, and so on. And it also had a danger that when these limited concentration industries don't provide anything beyond a certain range of achievement, then there isn't easy to go on to another area. I mean, I'm very interested in environmental friendly energy, by which I mean not only non-fossil fuel, that too, but also I'm very concerned about the nuclear energy, partly because I'm, as an advisor to Fukushima University, which I accepted being, I've been seeing how what looked like a secure position turned out to be not that at all. So you have to worry, but one of the good parts of the story in India is that the cost of solar energy production has dramatically fallen. And why? Mainly because the Chinese have been making much cheaper solar panels, which Americans are not admitting into their country, nor the Europe, on grounds that they want to protect their own industries, while lecturing to us against protection. On the other hand, the Indians have been quite open-minded on that, and actually the solar energy costs have correspondingly fallen. Now, I think it's the rain that if you can't do one thing, you do Mohawk Trail, or you could do solar panels, or you could do some other product, and so forth, which makes that, not having that flexibility, makes the Indian growth story rather limited. So I think there are two ways of telling the story. And unfortunately, since I've been associated since in the past, and I don't regret it, I've been emphasizing that you can't judge things by GDP growth alone. You have to see how people's lives are going. No matter what lecture I give, I can see the same headline next day saying, Sen says GDP growth not adequate. And this would undoubtedly be so summarized also. And that's not, I don't deny I'm saying that, but that may be in some ways perhaps the minor part of the story. The major part of the story, given particularly the concern with economic growth that people in India legitimately and rightly have, is that having an educated and healthy labor force is the biggest requirement of sustaining growth and development. And indeed, the whole issue about have growth first and then think about making it inclusive doesn't arise when you're doing it on the basis of labor productivity rise because of health and educational expansion. All these countries, Korea, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, increasingly Indonesia, which has overtaken India now with a much higher educational base and a much higher healthcare base, have done much more than we have. This is not even figured as a major obstacle. People talk mainly about various cunning commercial policies would bring India's growth rate back. Well, they might make a difference, certainly, I don't deny that. Commercial policies have use. But the long-run story is the bigger story. You need a vision about what kind of a country, what kind of a society, what kind of a connection between human beings and economic production we are looking at. Oddly enough, even though, as I mentioned, Marx did and John Stuart Mill did emphasize education a lot, in the European context, but it was part of the Industrial Revolution program. In fact, no one talked about education and skill formation more firmly than Adam Smith did. And as he put it, the reason we want good political economy, and he discussed why that may lead to high rates of growth, is for two reasons. One, it increases people's income, which allows them to the freedom to pursue the lives they would like to lead. What very often in the development literature is now called capability formation. Smith was talking about it very clearly at that time for the individual. And two, because it generates resources for the state or the commonwealth, and allowing it to do those things which the state alone can do. And these discussions included particularly education, but also social safety nets, and how that could be more rationally organized. Now, if you are doing it right from the beginning, you don't have to think of making the growth inclusive as a further step. That is the way growth is happening. I think inequality in China, it may conceivably be larger than in India, I don't know, but certainly no less. And yet, the absence of masses of illiterate people, masses of people who don't know where to go to for health care, masses of people who are left to the devices of the private doctor. Many of them are not doctors anyway, but offering private medical service at high prices of uncertain quality. Now, I think that is not a very good basis of either leading a good life and having a healthy life, nor is it a very, very good basis of having a labor force which is confident and which is able to do what it can do. Basically, I have to say, if you think about these classic distinctions, that if you think about the issue of inequality in two different ways, that of Smith and that of Marx, the Marxian issue about class differences is relatively less well addressed in China than the Smithian issue is. Marx was much more focused on conflict between different groups, also cooperation, but primarily conflict. Both were interested in conflict and cooperation, conflict and congruence. But Smith focused more on congruence and Marx on conflict. On the congruent side, Smith was saying that you could actually share this. You could make with a little expenditure the state can make, as he put it, every individual in the country well-schooled. And since the basis of economic growth and economic development is rising skill and rising productivity of human beings, that is the central issue to learn in this context. I think it's the Smithian policy that China has addressed very well, and earlier Korea and Taiwan and so on have also done. And we have left completely behind in that Smithian tale. Now, it's interesting that every time I talk on anything, I'm always asked the question that some people emphasize growth, you emphasize redistribution. But I haven't said a word on redistribution. Redistribution is to take income from the rich and give it to the poor. Not a bad thing, but I haven't talked about it. Not very much in any of my work. Because I thought that the main thing is to provide public services, health, education, immunization, shameful our numbers, about 70%, to all. And that's not rich to the poor. That is resources, whether raised from the incomes or from corporation or from whatever other source you might have of raising revenue for public services that are universally available for people. So if you're looking, if that is the story you're looking at, to summarize it is redistribution. I think it's a very peculiar thing. I think I've been giving so many interviews, I keep forgetting whether I've said this or not. But I think I saw when I was coming on the plane that somewhere I did say it, and I think rather unfairly said that you needed Derrida-like flexibility in interpreting language to translate that story into a redistribution story. As English is normally uttered, it isn't redistribution we are talking about, but it is talking about education and healthcare for all, nutrition for all, and it is talking also about the foundational connection between that and economic development. And as Smith said, the great serious market economy, and as Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong and China have been practicing, that is very good for the market economy too, to have a healthy, educated workforce. Now, I think shouldn't try to emphasize that point too much because there are other things to do, and looking forward to chatting with Siddharth. But the other point which I very briefly mentioned, which also figures, because is the story of Bangladesh. Because we were surprised that Bangladesh made so much progress in the period we are looking at. Not in every field. In terms of economic growth, we were doing better. We were 50% richer than Bangladesh in per capita terms in 20 years ago. And by about 2010, 11, we were 100% richer than Bangladesh. Where Bangladesh had a higher life expectancy. They used to have 3 years lower. Now they have 4 years more. Quite close to getting close to China, in fact. China a few years ago. Bangladesh had a lower mortality rate, higher gender inequality, equity, many indicators. Girls schooling. Bangladesh is the only country in the world where there are more girls in school than boys. And when it comes to such issues, and I'm not going into esoteric issues, not esoteric, very important, but there are too many issues like sex-specific abortion, selective abortion of female fetuses, which actually is very strong in north and west of India, and not present very much, present only a little, because the population is mixed. In the south and east, it's not the same classification as Irrawaddy, Kaveh, north and south. In fact, all from Assam, Bengal, actually including Bihar marginally, down to Kerala, the ratio in the 2011 census is still the same as the European range. It's within the European range, indeed the average of Italy, Greece, and Spain. North and west, including Gujarat and Maharashtra, and all the way going up to Haryana, and Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. The only country, only state in the Hindi belt which is out of it is Bihar. And you find these are all quite a bit lower than the European ratio. On the other hand, Bangladesh is, I don't think they kill male fetuses, but it might look like that because they're actually above the European range altogether, 972. The European average is 943, Indian average is 913, and so on. So Bangladesh's way of doing it wasn't like China's. They didn't spend as much money, they didn't have that much money to spend. On the other hand, they did a lot of education, in which VAC in particular played a very big part. I was quite impressed. I spent a day going to one VAC school after another. Very impressed with that. But one of the striking things is that if you look at Bangladeshi school teachers, health workers, not to mention family planning workers, and even in industrial labor force, you see enormously higher proportion of women than in India. Now, I think there's something to learn from Bangladesh because they achieved something on that basis. Now, is it sustainable? I think I would argue that in order to sustain, they have to do other things that the Asian development method is indicated, which includes educational and healthcare expansion, much more with resources coming from the state, and for that they may need more economic growth than they have now. Economic growth is a good thing. I'm often surprised when people seem to think that. I don't think it's a very good thing. So I think I would tend to leave it at that. And there are many things we discussed, but I want to emphasize that the book is also, it's not a thesis-oriented book only, it's also a presentation of India. We want to argue that you ought to know what India is like. And there are great achievements, but some gigantic non-achievements, we ought to know them. And the table, 60 pages of them, are done in a way that they're not done to fit the thesis. They're done generally. I used to, when very pathetically I was moving when my undergraduate days in Calcutta, then in Cambridge, from subject to subject, like maths and economics and philosophy. For a while I got very excited about history, and I found that one of the striking features of a historian I like very much is Clapham, is that one way I felt restricted is that he seemed to quote tables only when they illustrate the point he's making. So I wanted to do a non-Claphamish book on India, which we did. And I think I was rewarded that some people who don't agree with me, when arguing with him, was quoting from my table. Old friend of mine, Gurcharan Das, I was having lunch, and he was arguing against my thesis, but all the time quoting my own table. That I thought was a success, because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to present a picture where you can look. But basically, we were arguing that this is what India is. Looks like these are all the relevant variables that we could get hold of. We think this is the analysis, and we think this is the what we should recommend. If you don't agree, tell us why not. You've got all the data there that we draw our thesis on, and indeed that are available in most fields as much as we could get at the level at which of generality as we were looking at that. So that is ultimately what it is. It's a book on India rather than a book on a particular thesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I take charge?
We'll have a highway to go to soon. That was about 40 years ago. I was always ridiculed for saying that Kerala cannot sustain it. One of my teachers, John Robinson, told me that Kerala and Sri Lanka are trying to taste the fruit of a tree without growing it. Hard to think of a worse analogy than that, actually, because it's a tree where having the fruit makes the tree grow. and of course that happened. So now the story is somewhat changed. People don't say, I had told you so, that Kerala can't sustain it, because it has sustained it, but it ended up being one of the richest in Indian states. Himachal Pradesh, when it started, I had a similar skepticism, because I had got used to the fact that in the south they could do it because of the historical reasons. But of course Himachal did do it. And their growth rate has been very fast. And I think that connection is very important for us to take, because I think within Himachal, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, there's a lot for us to learn. And when people say, people have given it up because they've tried it and it doesn't work. Well, what do you mean it doesn't work? The other state to look at is oddly enough, Korea, South Korea. Because initially they also expanded the coverage very quickly, and the quality control came much later. But the quality control came with a great deal of emphasis precisely on quality. I don't think we are going in that direction. If we say that we might abolish the exams and testing is a bad thing, I think that maybe at a very luxurious level, high, it is a bit like Gandhi's basic education. Tagore was capable of that too. In Shantiniketan, where I was schooled, there was a year in which exams were all abolished. I wasn't still there. I wasn't yet there in school. But I think my mother was in that period, because some method came in attached to some English guru like Dalton or someone who had said the exams are a bad thing. The result, of course, was that people didn't have to do anything whatsoever. I think if we are really concerned about quality, and here we may, I mean, I'm like you of the left, we may have to cut some company, because a lot of the left rhetoric is in that direction. I think we do need to do what the Koreans did. Now, Koreans may have overdone it now, because they are now, of course, not only has the highest PISA scores in the world, but they're continuing to do it. But I think, and there may be a sense of proportion we ought to have, but we can't raise quality without concentrating on raising quality. And I am not pessimistic, because we have done nothing to raise quality. It's never been a factor. And in this respect, I think the left hasn't been much used at all.
Yeah. In fact, one of the valuable aspects of the book, and this I think I would like to share with readers, is that it contains material that refutes the dogmas both of the left and the right. The left, for example, which valorizes subsidies without going into detail about who actually benefits from whether it's the fertilizer subsidy, for example, or the underpricing of electricity, without going into the details of who is the ultimate beneficiary. There is a certain blind attachment to or sanctity given to these subsidies, which make it very difficult then for any government to actually address them. And I think one section of the book very lucidly actually illustrates how this is a drag on the healthy evolution of public policy in India. And I think this is something which I think every left
politician and every left-inclined individual really should read. One aspect which I felt was, it's there in the book, but perhaps slightly underplayed, and maybe underplayed because your focus is on the larger development issues. But there is some, which is and the thing that is ignored is the, or not foregrounded, is the role of the corporate sector. You have mentioned in various places examples of revenue write-offs and subsidies that they have glommed for themselves. But in many ways, the rent-seeking behavior that we see across so many resources is the mirror of, is the reflection on the one side, on the other side of all the neglect of health education that we see in our country. Is this something that you? Have you focused a little bit more on the numbers, on the for example, the 2G scam, the way in which resources are systematically underpriced? You have iron ore royalties not revised for 30 years. Virtually every mineral, once you get a concession to mine it, you can do it at a throwaway price that has no bearing with global prices. Maybe Bangladesh has escaped some of and is able to do something on the development side because they don't have such a large corporate/rentier class. How's that for a theory?
Well, it's a good theory. But as I got used to when I have to argue with students, that this is a brilliant theory, but it would be even more effective if we understand its limitations. So let me say something in favor. Bangladesh was very lucky in land reform, mainly for communal reasons, because primarily the landlords were Hindus. This says something about the nature of Muslim rule in Bengal. The fact that after 200 years of Muslim rule, actually 400 years of Muslim rule, still the landlords remain primarily Hindu. Well, they of course expanded under the British. But even if you look at, say, Siraj's friends, Clive writing a letter saying, among your close friends, why don't you consult? He was trying to cheat. He was attacking, but he was like Siraj al-Dawla to think he did not know. He was no such intention. Why don't you ask your friend? And he names his close friends. Of which, if I remember right, of the I think of the 6, there are 4 Hindus and 2 Muslims. So I think that meant that there was a kind of a lot of Hindu landlords. And of course, as soon as the partition came, they disappeared. One of the great interesting books is that of Tapan Rai Chaudhary, who comes from such a landlord family, and discusses how terribly oppressive the system was earlier, and how suddenly one day it all ended. And it achieved a land reform, which Bengal and Kerala will have to work hard to achieve, and which West Pakistan or Pakistan now had not yet achieved. So I think they were lucky in that respect. I think the corporate sector, to a great extent, it had, and among the corporate, the big corporates included BRAC and Grameen Bank, which made the nature of the corporate sector quite different. So there are a number of factors. But I think there were 3 things as to why we did we not think it's an important issue? Yes, we did think. First of all, we were not absolutely certain how much of an empirical basis we could provide in terms of our tabular structure, tables and so on. That was one. Just basically it would be a weaker link in the argument, even if we did believe it, and believe it to be mostly right. That was one reason. A second reason was that there was increasingly, very much related to the line that you were saying, but that wasn't your conclusion, is to say that the real problem is crony capitalism, rent-seeking. What we need is real capitalism. What we were arguing is that we need good capitalism for some sectors, but even the best of capitalism is not going to work for healthcare and education. So that attacking crony capitalism is in some way diverting the argument. The third thing is that, and that we do discuss, is that and this may be, we may disagree, I don't know. I think I would divide the impact of the corporate sector. Those which are traditional cupidity, a traditional way of earning more money, which is controllable, it seems to me, they're primarily matters of policing, actually. We underestimate the role of policing. I'm glad that in the Nirbhaya Jyoti case has come up that the policing is a very central story. Quite a lot of it is as much a fault of bad policing and corruption. And the culture of corruption, and again, I hope I'm not differing from you, was vastly fed by the terrible license raj we had, which allowed the government to make a little concession and make a gigantic amount of money. So there was that. But there was another side, that the business could not only influence business decision, but could actually discuss the media, affect the media discussion. Now, if I thought that business media could attack you very easily, that conviction has not weakened over the course of the last week when my book has come out, because certainly I've got a pretty relentless attack from part of the sector. Now, we do discuss how it is possible for the excessive power of corporate to affect the public dialogue. This doesn't mean that it's necessarily in the long-run interest of capitalism either. I think an educated, healthy labor force, as Jamshedji Tata clearly recognized, is very good for industries. But if you fall prey to ideologues, then you may not be able to, in fact, see which way ultimately your long-run interest lies. And I think every time I've talked about education and healthcare or nutrition, I was told that I was going to want to take India back to license raj, even though I've on record for 30 years on that subject, and something of that kind. Now that we found to be much more of a problem, because we had to win the media argument in order to bring about the change that we want, which we believe would not only be good for the people, but would be ultimately good for business as well. So I think that sort of led us to have a slightly different focus. Could we have gone more into it? Perhaps you're right. Could we have?
Maybe
already, this book was going to be written in 6 months or a year. It took 3.5 years, knocking me out of every other work I've done. And every time I met Jean in Shantiniketan, our home, when we closed all doors and pursued that, I said, look, this is going to be the last time we are meeting. I wasn't going to do another one to add another section on the corporate sector. In any case, it was 100 pages, and now it looks like a gigantic book. And so there was also that.
I think that could be the subject of another book, perhaps in the future. I want to. They're getting a little bit. The organizers standing up.
Are they going to ask?
I think they're going to ask questions. But I just wanted to,
I want to hear. Yeah.
As an editor, I wanted to also raise one question about the media, or speak out a little bit in defense of my tribe, as it were, which is that I think your book is very accurate in terms of identifying the sins of a large section of the media, no, undoubtedly, and I think collectively we have no option but to plead guilty. On the other hand, the same media, which is dependent on advertising, which is a corporate media, whatever you want to call it, has also been the one that has shone the light on a number of important scams that have come up. That also reports, not a lot, but a reasonable amount on things happening. The problems of deprivation, the plight of the suffering of ordinary people at the hands of law enforcement, even in Kashmir, other places. The problem is that, and this is my serious question to you, that I often feel a sense of frustration when we write things, and even when we write things in a fairly sustained manner, and they don't have the kind of impact on the system, on the judiciary, on the government, that they ought to. I'll give you a small example. I mean, in Chennai right now, for the last month, The Hindu has been running a campaign on the absence of sidewalks, absence of footpaths. And we've sort of coined this the right to walk. And we've said that, Chennai residents should be able to move around without, bumping into a car or a shop that's encroached, this sort of thing. when we publish a photograph of a particularly egregious, violation of a pavement, the corporation may act the next day. But we see very little indication so far that the system is willing to change the way it thinks about urban spaces, because these are systemic flaws that that we're up against, and sometimes I feel a little bit frustrated at the absence of our inability to move the system in that direction. So I just wonder whether what you are capturing is not so much the failure of the media to write on certain things, as opposed to the complete unresponsive nature of the system. In other words, this wider political failing. No doubt the role of the media is endogenous to that. But there's maybe some flaw in the way in which Parliament works, in the way in which decisions get taken. Incidentally, one, I think, element which should be factored into the rising inequality aspect is increasing number of high net worth individuals who are actually becoming members of Parliament. It used to be in the good old days that they would fund politicians, fund MPs, but now many of them are actually entering the House directly. And this is also going to affect the quality of decision making in some way, and maybe push the importance of public policies even further into the distance.
Yeah, no, I think I don't disagree with any of the things you said, Siddharth. I think three things, though, to add to it. One is that we do actually discuss the success of the media. In fact, at one stage in my family, I was known as a lackey of the media, because I was, as one of my children said, you're always writing very good. They say famines don't happen because of media and so on. So you say nice things about the media and they give you a big coverage. So there's nothing surprising about that. Since the main coverage I was getting in Delhi was with pictures with Sharmila Tagore next to me, I said, now that's not working. I worked out the second system, namely stand close to Sharmila Tagore and be photographed. But I have praised the media a lot, and in this book too we do. And not just famine. I think the fact that the threatened AIDS crisis didn't happen, media had a very constructive role in making people understand it. Not enough to change out things like transport planning. For example, there's always been a case for much more railways and much less road on economic ground. Then there's environmental ground, but there's also AIDS-related ground. So we haven't been successful, but media has tried on that, certainly. No, I don't think we blame that. But secondly, I think our point is that media is not doing its job. It's not doing its job enough. And sometimes, and your paper has had an interest in social issues. We do give examples of that. But and many of the Indian medias have. But part of our thesis is that the media could do these things, and there we might disagree whether it succeeds. I think you succeed in the right to walk as well. It's not so easy for that to come about. I know that even in the context of the United States, when I first moved there in the late 1980s, the most striking thing that someone coming from England, since I was teaching in Oxford before, is that there isn't a thing like National Health Service. So I wrote a number of things in things like Scientific American. They were published and they were read, and I think I got nice letters from people. But then nothing seemed to be happening. But then there were a lot of other people doing it too. But then eventually, first in the Clinton period and then with Obama, there was an action. So I think, I hope we shouldn't lose steam at this time. It makes a real difference ultimately. I think the third point is that it's very important to convey. I think that way the left-right division has an element of counterproductiveness in it, because it's very much my thesis also that it's ultimately strongly in the interest of business India India incorporated, is that the term? To have an educated, healthy labor force. And what was clear more than 100 years ago to Jamsetji Tata should be clear to the businessmen. And the attacking dogs that come in the sense of people saying, you believe in this or you believe in that, which are very often, quite often internet-based, but sometimes business media-based too. I mean, to be fair, they will publish the other side of the story as well. That will tend to have the feature of an educational role. And we do take the Ambedkar role, educate, organize, agitate being the main thing. And some of that conversion, we hope, and, making people be influenced by this, is on the educational side. And that's, the left-right division tend to, by assuming the unreformability of business media, business and therefore business media, assume a kind of cynicism that's not justified. It's oddly enough, since I've been doing the Marx-Smith contrast record, from my childhood days go back there, it's more the Smithian view, because Smith thought that businessmen essentially are not good people. Really, he thought not. It's very peculiar, because he is the great guru of the market economics, but he had a very low opinion of businessmen. Marx always thought that they are socially influenced by the milieu in which they are. Comes out most clearly in things like German ideology. They captured in that ideology, and they could liberate themselves. So I think there's a very interesting thing to discuss, and in fact, increasing the left has taken the Smithian position, not taking the Marxian position of what used to be called in the good old days, the improvability of human beings.
We'll now like to open the floor for discussion. You'll pass the mics around, right? If you could just keep the question very short and brief, yeah?
Good evening, sir. My question to you was, you would have heard recently that in Finland they've crowdsourced legislation. There's this new system there is that if I think
Can you hold it closer to your mouth?
What I was saying is there's this new concept that's come up of crowdsourcing legislation. Like usually what happens is lobbies make legislation that are then passed in parliament and stuff. So in Finland now they're starting to crowdsource legislation, like one about about a new how changing the copyright laws, and this way they're cutting. What I feel is that this way they're stopping the lobbies from having such a strong influence on government policies. So do you think that by actually having the population make legislation that the parliament then has to vote upon, is that a way forward for democracy instead of the pseudo-democracy that we have right now?
Some of it I heard, but my hearing is not that good. Yeah.
In Finland, they have an initiative to crowdsource legislation. So ordinary citizens make suggestions. And is that a better way to draft laws than...
Yeah. I don't know about the Finnish thing. You send me some reading on that. I promise I'm going to read and learn from it, and I might even write to you. Okay? Send me that. Thank you. I'm sorry, but I can't, I'm always very flattered when people assume I know more than I do. But that's way beyond what I know.
So what happened?
Excuse me, sir.
yeah, go ahead.
Sir, this is Piyush. You talked about Mahalanobis model, where the state...
Talk about what?
Mahalanobis model.
Mahalanobis, no, I would think of Mahalanobis' thinking. It wasn't Mahalanobis' model.
Where the role of state was capacity generation. So do you think that there is a more scope for infrastructure building in the fields of education, healthcare, power and transportation and soft infrastructure, rather than investing in something like capacity building, which should be probably left to the market?
You know, I think it has often been thought, I'm glad you asked the question, that Mahalanobis went for state as opposed to market. He went for basic industries, heavy industries. And there's some truth in that, but not all, actually. Because I was arguing that no matter how faulty that might have been, the biggest fault was that it downplayed education altogether. And I think that's the point I was trying to make. And I personally, you know, after all, the focus that he had towards heavy industries, you know, steel was one of the big things he was doing. At that time, it looked as if it was very counterproductive because those were the days when charkars and so on were a big thing. I don't think people regard steel, I mean, since one Indian or another between them seem to own much of steel production in the world, whether it be Chorus in Britain or the Mitchells owning enormous amount of steel there. I don't think there is it's generally not thought to have been a very peculiar thing to have done. I think the peculiar thing to have done was missing out so comprehensively. Lessons on both sides, from Japan and what was happening contemporarily in Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, at the same time also missing out the lessons of Soviet Union and the communist country. And I think this basic skepticism about education played a very, very big part in keeping India back. And in that, as one side, as the rather restricted vision of the business compared with the broad vision of Jamsetji played a part. On the other hand, these models which didn't accommodate education at all, or healthcare, also played a part. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Good evening, sir. I'm Megnath from St. Xavier's College. Sir, the Indian government has done several things to tackle what it calls the country's greatest internal threat, from Salwa Judum and SPOs to even Operation Green Hunt. But sir, the rise of radicalism that we see on both sides of this conflict, the Indian government as well as the Naxals, has brought us to a situation that the Indian government claims is not conducive for socio-economic growth and development. Sir, how do you rate India's tackling of this issue, and what do you recommend?
So what issue? Oh, Naxalites, yeah.
And what do you recommend the Indian government does to salvage what is clearly a deteriorating crisis?
You know, I think that's a different subject from the subject of the book, actually, as you no doubt recognize. Yeah, I have no difficulty and no objection to sharing speculative thoughts on that. You know, when the Naxalites came, it began as a kind of enormously egalitarian move. And it had a basis of being confined to higher educational sector initially, Presidency College, St. Stephen's College, and so on. You said St. Xavier's, I don't know whether they were here or not. But certainly in the days when I was teaching in Delhi School of Economics, they were producing the smartest of the plays, including a very highbrow adaptation of Macbeth. But the underlying concern was deeply about equity. But then there was a kind of open-mindedness about how to pursue that. And a number of the Naxalites actually took the movement of what they see as Maoism or shining Pathism to be a mistake. To give an example from Bengal, Santosh Rana, who is a Naxalite leader, but not of a branch of the party which is Maoist in that sense, and renounces violence, renounces killing of landlords or policemen, and wants to fight elections. Also Naxalite movement. Now, in some ways it's easier for me to recognize the Naxalites you knew among my students, both then in Calcutta and in Delhi and in Calcutta, in the kind of position that Santosh is taking, rather than the kind of rather more violent position. I don't think there exists any reasoning human being in India who can deny that there's a gigantic problem of inequality here. In fact, our book could itself be a handbook to illustrate why that problem is big. I think the main difficulty comes about what kind of a solution we think could work. There's one side, the Gandhian idea about what kind of means could with violence be allowed or not. There's the other issue, would it achieve anything? We know many examples like Shining Path in Latin America not producing anything other than a fair number of killings. So I think there's also the question of effectiveness. That's where the territory is. Now, do I have a solution? No, I don't have a solution. Do I think that we have reason to be worried about those concerns which at least formally move the Naxalite movement, namely deep inequalities in power, in opportunity as well as ownership? I think we have every reason to try to understand the enormity of these problems. Do I have to agree that what they're pursuing in, say, Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand is correct? It doesn't follow at all. We have to examine that. Do I think that there are people who need defense, despite the fact that whether or not they may have sympathy in that position, but their human rights should not be violated? Since I spent a lot of time agitating for the freeing of Amartya Sen, I can tell you that I take the view that their human rights should not be violated. But there is a gigantic issue involved about law and order in Chhattisgarh and so on. And so, do I have a solution? No, I do not. But the book isn't about that. And maybe you would someday write a book on that, which I will read.
Yeah, I mean, the book provides the backstory for many of these problems. But a question for the lady here. Yeah.
Sir, it's very encouraging to hear you, because I was your student in Delhi School of Economics, and for some time I was taken back to those days. Now, coming to my question, water is very central to the themes that you have always taken up, and especially this theme, an uncertain glory. Just I'm thought-provoked to ask, such details you have covered, education, public health, etc. Why water has, I mean, maybe I've just glanced through the book. Water is very central to whatever you are saying.
Water.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Because in future, a lot of problems can come up, more than others.
Yeah, we do say some things about water, but perhaps not an adequate amount. I don't know. Should there have been more balance on that side? I just don't know. It's possible. The inequalities in water are quite different from inequalities that come because of not having schools or not having hospitals. Should that have prevented us from discussing water? I don't know. But, you know, there was also a point as to how big we wanted the book to be, how comprehensive. Perhaps we made a mistake, but I'll think about that. But I think we did try to cover a lot of problems.
Professor Sen, how do we go about creating a culture or actually a constituency of change? So what I actually mean specifically here is, you know, the politician, for example, winning the next election on the back of, you know, a good performance in primary education or primary health, or for that matter, the bureaucrat, you know, kind of getting rewarded for, you know, performing well and, you know, implementing change in a major way on the primary health space. So that was one question that I had for you. Second is that how much of a, you know, if you look back at India's, you know, dismal record in this area, we have disproportionately spent a fair bit of, higher spend on higher education. So how much of an impact do you think our obsession with almost a Brahmanical higher education version has had on diluting our focus on the primary education sector?
Well, both are very good questions. The first one is about I didn't fully hear it. I mean, I'm partly because I'm elderly, but partly also because I've just flown from Delhi, and I think my ears are blocked still. But the first part seemed to be connected with rewarding achievements and so on. Yeah. We haven't made a great study on that, but I personally have, on the basis of whatever studies I've done over the year, I tended to think that the financial rewarding incentives are often overestimated, and we underestimate the various things that make people move, and including sometimes competition and keeping up with the Joneses, but also cooperation, having a sense of obligation. I've tried to write fairly extensively on that, and so the rational choice, quote-unquote, theory, which assumes that only reward is something to which financial reward you respond to, I don't accept, and I would apply the same thing here. So if we have to build a culture of an uncorruptible administration, I wouldn't look for just giving them more money anyway, and then say they would not accept bribes. I think I would look for trying to build up a value structure, which is not that difficult, where you don't take that. You regard, it's one thing where nearly everyone is doing something, and quite another where no one is doing it, and you decide to take a bit of bribe. When I was advising the Italian government, for a short while I was official advisor to the Italian Parliament's anti-mafia commission, because mafia was connected with corruption. And I actually, in that capacity, even visited Sicily. And I've never been in a situation when I had 3 armed guards in front of me and 3 armed guards behind me. And my wife inquired, did I feel more secure? And I had to write back saying, I've never felt less secure in my life than at that moment. But the interesting thing is that among the reasoning, this was, by the way, Violante Commission. Violante was the leader of it, who later became the chair of the upper house of Italian Parliament. Violante Commission found that the strongest argument given for, there are 2 arguments mostly given for why you're so corrupt. One is that everybody does it, and it's not so special. Why look at me only? And the other is that if everybody is bribing, if I refuse to bribe, I would never get any of the things. I have to have a competitive bribery. All these require an institutional systematic change, but the positive thing is that it is particularly happened. Italy has a lot of problems. I think the biggest problem at the moment is mismanagement of the economy on the instructions of the European Commission. But leaving out those bits of my personal beliefs as to what's gone wrong with Europe, the fact is they don't have that level of corruption that they had earlier. And there was a kind of virtuous circle too. As the culture of bribery went down, it affected things. A bit like what happened in Chinese food bundling. There's quite a lot of studies on that until about, the parents agreed that they would not allow their daughter to be food-bound. And when it was 20-30%, it was very struggling. By the time about 35 to 40% had signed it, it just snowballed into 100% quite rapidly. And similarly, it's all the same in Senegal about genital mutilation. So I think we underestimate the power of social conformity. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Well, that brings our discussion part to an end, and I'd like to hand the mic or proceedings back to Penguin.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Professor Sen. I'm sure all of us enjoyed that talk. That's all we have for this evening. We have books, Professor Sen's books at the back being sold. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
About half an hour? Huh? 15, 20 minutes? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? Okay. Well, it's difficult for, I mean, Professor Sen covered so much of his book and explained it also well that maybe I should use the time available to me to focus on a few things that I think are important and to perhaps also maybe push him a bit on in a couple of areas where I don't agree or where I think more focus is needed. I want to start though by putting on the record or placing before him and you my deep appreciation of the book itself. In my past life, I was an economics student, and as an undergraduate at the London School of Economics and an undergraduate, as many of us at the LSE in those days tended to be, coming from the left side of the flank. I remember feeling very frustrated in my first and second year during the lectures of our favorite economic teacher was the Japanese professor Michio Morishima. Wonderful old man, and he was teaching us basic macro. And he had a side life as a Marxist economist, and I happened to read one of his essays, which dealt with subjects completely differently from what he was teaching in class. And I went to his office during one of his office hours, and I said, Professor, I'm a bit puzzled. I said, on the one hand, you believe in all of this stuff that's in this journal, and then you're teaching this other stuff, which doesn't seem to me very relevant to the problems of ordinary people. And he said, look, most of the undergraduates that we prepare at the LSE, they go on to join the stock exchange, apologies to BSc, or banks, and he says, I said, no, but I want to go on to graduate school. He says, even then, he says, don't ask these kinds of questions now. Wait till you get to grad school. And of course, I went to grad school, and even there I got similar discouragement. Don't ask these kinds of questions. Economics is a technical science. The focus of economics on how ordinary people live their lives, that focus began to seem to me increasingly remote as a student. And to fast forward, when my first media job as an editorial writer at the Times of India, I was hired as an economics writer because of my background. And the first few pieces that I wrote were judged a little bit too critical of the prevailing orthodoxy. And so the message was gently conveyed to me by no less a person than the owner of the newspaper, who said, I think it's better you focus on politics and foreign policy. But the owner, Mr. Samir Jain. Mr. Samir Jain. He said, it's better you write on politics or foreign policy. I think forget the economics part. So I think your book is a wonderful corrective for me, and I think for a whole generation of people who have studied or learned or imbibed economics through the media, which is essentially a certain kind of an orthodoxy, which fetishizes double-digit numbers or statistics of one kind or the other. I agree with, I don't think we should run down growth. Growth is important. But as this book illustrates, what you do with growth, how you deploy the output that growth generates is the key to ensuring the sustainability of that growth, as well as the fact that, ensuring that people have a better life. And clearly by that final yardstick, as the book comprehensively demonstrates, and often distressingly so, we have vastly underperformed on all the vital indicators that we really ought to have done. And for me, the most sobering table, Professor Sen ended on Bangladesh, and the most sobering table, those of you who are presumably going to buy the book afterwards, table 3.6, where Drez and Sen have laid out selected indicators of public health, comparing India and Bangladesh. And I'll just read you the first one. Proportion of households practicing open defecation. In India, it's 55%. In Bangladesh, it's only 8.4%. And they've laid out a lot of other indicators where Bangladesh does much better. So I want to ask you to begin with, we are essentially the same people. I don't think the quality of the Bangladeshi politician is all that much higher than that of the Indian. The Bangladeshi media, for all the faults that you've outlined in your book about the Indian media, I would say the Bangladeshi media shares a large part of that. The bureaucracy is drawn from the same gene pool. What explains Bangladesh's success in being focused on these, on the importance of these kinds of things when compared to India?
Well, I think that's a very, is this working?
It is.
It's a very complicated question, and I've tried to think about it. I think the nature of the Bangladeshi independence movement had a lot to do with that. It generated a kind of radicalization where they were questioning a lot of things that they had not questioned earlier. And it's not so much that the leadership of the Bangladeshi Mukti Bahini were women, but the issue of women was a recurrent thing, and one of the contrasts with West Pakistan, as it was then called, that was being drawn, was constantly that even figured among the Army League's program. And you are right that, in fact, the Bangladeshi media had most of the same faults that we have. But I must say, for a fairly longish time, I felt that women's issues did get a bigger coverage there. In a very small way, when, with my Nobel money, I wanted to start to trust. And I wanted to do, I did that, it's called Patichi Trust, named after my home. And the Patichi Trust India, primarily been concerned with basic education, basic healthcare. And when when we talked about how to do with the Bangladesh, what to do with the Bangladeshi Trust, the uniform thing was that we want to do something about gender equity. And in fact, one of the first things that we did was to start a program of women journalists who are not necessarily brilliant students, who probably will not go to college for either economic means reasons or for other reasons of not having done so well, but who are very interested in covering. So what happened is that we did a joint project with Potomalo and Matiur Rahman, who was there, then the editor. So we did it jointly. We also had some help from BRAC in that. There was and what these women did was they went to the rural areas and wrote about what they saw. And I have to say, Matiur, as a great editor, was spending an incredible amount of time correcting them, publishing many of them. And for those, it was a touching thing for me, where there's those which were rejected. He often wrote a letter explaining why he couldn't publish it. And that's really a fantastic thing. And if you look at these things, and I went for some years, I don't have the time now going so often, to the meeting of these women who had gone, young women. Before we became very gender sensitive, we would have said young girls, but we can't say that now. So accepting that language is odd, because I was traveling in an Air India flight, and I was a woman pilot next to me. And I said, how many women pilots are there? And she said, oh, I think they have forgotten the number. I think there are 15 of us girls. And I said, look, it's only because you're a woman, you're getting away. I would have been hauled for that.
Right.
But there is that issue of deep commitment. Now, it was feeding also on the fact that there is a long history in Bengal, of which West Bengal has done far less on that. If you think about the literature, you think about classics like Fuller, Barmasha, and so on.
Yeah.
Fuller, Barmasha is a long epic poem about how they knew how difficult the life of a woman is in a rural area, written about 400 years ago. So I think they made a great deal, and the fact that they were becoming rather Bengali patriotic, which is not in general a good thing to do. Language patriotism, I'm not in favor. On the other hand, Bangladesh's conflict was a very progressive movement. It was the alternative to Hindu-Muslim divide, and it was the inclusive thing. But they were going back if you go to their museum, you'd see how much of the past there is.
Right.
And they were also unearthing these things, bringing that out enormously. So I think the nature of the politics certainly played a part in that. I don't know more about this, but there was this commitment, and the commitment took the form of having women workers in hospitals, in schools, in family planning, and so on. And that itself, the fact that they were doing very well, brought about a change. And then the garment industry, of course, had raised other issues, because while women's agency was changing the lives of men, women, and children,
Right.
they were not sufficiently looking after their own safety, judging from what had happened. But we have to have a sense of proportion about how much is achieved and what these problems were. I think I would look for a kind of political combined social solution. It's similar to the contrast between East-South
Right.
versus North-South, North-West we're looking at.
Right.
What do we look for? So I think I would go in that direction.
The emphasis on the public provision of health and education, something you've been writing about for ages, and the impact of this on policymakers is at best very, very mixed. If anything, the data suggests that if you look at the increasing privatization of schools, increasing privatization or private provision of healthcare, the numbers seem to be getting worse and worse each year. Do you think it's possible, in the case of education, it would seem difficult to try to turn the clock back to the recommendations of the Kothari Commission in the 60s, which said that there should be common neighborhood schools, which is what every modern developing country had. It seems difficult to think that we could go back to that kind of an idea. But in the area of health, do you think, even at this late stage, a determined push for a Chinese-style push, you said 2004, 2005, the kind of thing they did, is such a thing possible? Do you think this is what the present government or the next government should take up as a priority, to create that robust public health system? Is it possible? Is it financially feasible?
Oh, financially, it's certainly feasible. You see, the oddity is that the fiscal crunch, which is always mentioned, is probably the least of the difficulties. The biggest difficulty are the organizational limitation that we happen to have. The fiscal thing is, I've been saying that in most of the interviews. We live in a sea of subsidies, actually. And another one of the things that sometimes when it's attributed to me, I have to say that I'm actually opposed. So I'm basically against subsidies unless it is either something like education, which is basic for all, universal healthcare, or goes for the very poor. But usually what happens is that people say that we cannot afford this kind of expenditure while you're sitting in an air-conditioned room which has which is consuming subsidized electricity. 2% of the GDP goes in that direction. And a whole lot of them, actually. Diesel, cooking gas, not collecting duty on gold. It's a gigantic number. I think the main difficulty is organization. But I think the best thing to look at there is not China, because we are not going to get into that state like that. I think the two more interesting examples are, one is within the country and one is abroad. Within the country, because there have been states which have done well, like Kerala. What is it that they did? Then there was one state like Himachal Pradesh when it started, because Jean told me that, they are doing the same. And I remained a little skeptical in the way that people used to be skeptical of me when I said that Kerala was doing it, and indeed